There are stories that say in Siam, now Thailand, that if the king was upset with a member of his court, he might gift that person with the gift of a white elephant. Now, on one hand, this is a gift of priceless value. A white elephant is a sacred image in Buddhism, and Buddhism is practiced throughout Thailand. But on the other, more practical hand, even as the member of court would have to vow and thank the king emphatically for this wonderful, wonderful gift, he knew that in receiving this gift, his life had been changed. For he was receiving literally an animal that would eat him out of house and home. An animal he could never re-gift because that would be giving away the gift of the king. An animal he had no choice but to treat like gold. In other words, while the term white elephant has devolved in our society into a term describing useless little items we might bring to bingo to give away for laughs, the real white elephant was a game changer. And the king knew that with this gift, the recipient would be controlled. Controlled because, well, he would be using all of his assets to support the gift. The king knew he would be controlled because with the gift, the king had placed his servant, his irritating little servant, in a box. And no matter how beautiful a box might be, a box is still a box. We get this kind of strange story today about David. Now, it serves us to remember that just a few years before this, David had been the youngest of 7 or 8 sons, depending on where you're reading in the Bible, and he had been tending the family sheep, the lowliest job a Jewish kid could have. And God took him out of that. God sent the prophet Samuel to anoint David king over bad King Saul. God had defended him in his one-on-one duel with the giant Goliath. God had placed him in Saul's service, where he played the harp and sang songs to calm the nerves of the mad king. He had become the best friend of Jonathan, the prince. David became Saul's most able general, only to then have to run away because Saul was so jealous of him, he was trying to kill him. And finally, David had to stand by and watch as Saul, and as his friend Jonathan, met a grisly end at the hands of the Philistines. David had risen to power. He had beaten down his enemies, and now he was setting up shop. And so he says to the prophet Nathan, "See now, I'm living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God stays in a tent." Remember your Indiana Jones. The Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of God, that was considered the throne of God. The people of Israel thought that God was literally sitting on this throne. And remember, it's a mobile throne, okay? The priests carry it around. Except there's this really cool story where one time the ark gets captured by the Philistines in a battle, and they take it home. And then they realize everybody that comes near it starts to die. So they put it on an ox cart and it drives itself home. David's intentions here, they're good. He and God had been inseparable for years. Over and over again in the Bible, David's actions and thoughts are applauded by God. God had great love for David. And so when David says, "Let's build God a house," Nathan says, "Go for it, dude." But that night, Nathan has a dream. And in the dream, God says, "No way. You will not build me a house. I will build you a house." And I think in a very real way, God is saying, I am still God. I am still the one who is providing, and I will provide. And you will not place me in your container. You will not put me in your box. When human beings start building temples and start formalizing this thing we call faith into the thing we call religion, we tend to start to build boxes for God. And we start hearing or thinking that if you just do this and you just do that, then God will be pleased and God will give you a good life. And we see this happen in the history of Israel. After David, they went ahead and they built that temple. And people literally started to think, that's God's house. God lives there. He stays in there. And they also thought, well, just do your sacrifices, just do all the cool temple stuff. We can live however we want. God will be happy. God will protect us. And this, of course, starts a huge argument in the Old Testament. An argument that featured the temple priests on one hand, who were in charge of all the cool temple stuff, and who often said, hey, just do the stuff, God will be happy. And the prophets who looked around and saw all the injustice starting to happen in the land, and who started saying things like, thus saith the Lord, I despise your feasts, I hate your sacrifices. The temple priests, the keepers of the beautiful box called the temple, versus the prophets who said, you don't get it. God, I think, sees that David, is in danger of traveling a path where he could start to believe God could be kept in a box. David is in danger of traveling a path of thinking that, hey, if I just build God a house, sacrifice to God, make it nice and cozy, God will just give and give and give. Life will be flowers and ice cream. David is in danger of thinking that somehow he might start to control God. He is in danger of succumbing to superstition. Wait a minute, you might be saying. Superstition? When we think if we act in a certain way, God will therefore act in a certain way, we are succumbing to superstition. Superstition's all about controlling the outcomes, right? Like when you wear the pair of socks you wore in that big game that you won once so that you'll win the next big game. And God does not like the notion of being controlled. God does not like being the subject of superstition. This argument I'm talking about that was going on in the Old Testament between the priests and the prophets, it's really part of a larger argument in the Old Testament. It's that argument that says, if you act in life a certain way, God will give you all the good stuff. Versus the other side of the argument in the Old Testament that says, life doesn't work that way, God does not work that way. Folks, we live in a fallen creation. A creation that's filled with free will and fallen stuff. And sometimes life just happens. Remember Jesus' commentary on the Tower of Siloam, that tower that fell in Jerusalem? He said, do you think those 18 people who died when the Tower of Siloam fell were worse sinners than all the other folks living in Jerusalem? The answer is, of course not. Life happens. Life is going to happen. Life is going to keep happening for reasons beyond our understanding. That's just how life is. But God provides. The unboxed God provides and brings us understanding and learning and new resolve as we rise above calamity. The unboxed God teaches us to stand still and strong against the winds of a storm. The unboxed God teaches us how to breathe, even in times when we have every reason not to catch our breath. I do not personally believe that everything happens for a reason. I don't think that's what Jesus says. Actually, I have a saying of my own. Everything happens for a reason, and the reason is something else did not happen. The idea that everything happens for a reason can become the backbone of really bad religion, because it makes life into this puzzle, this puzzle that maybe we ought to be able to figure out, maybe we ought to be able to control, and it can make God into this boxed supernatural deity who will respond positively as long as we push the right buttons and pull the right levers. And what happens when it doesn't work? What happens when tragedy strikes? We feel responsible. We feel like we failed. We might even feel guilt. I think all of this is what God is rebelling against in this story of David. And God is saying instead, God will provide, and God would provide in an ancestor of David we know as Christ. I think we need to free ourselves from this notion that God can be controlled. And instead just remember, God is there for us when life happens. How many times have we said to ourselves, or even have seen people walk away from the faith saying something like, I was a good Christian, but God let that happen to me. I did what I was supposed to do, but God, the great gift-giving machine in the sky, did not. Too many people have succumbed to this lie that somehow we should be able to control our lives. We should be able to control God through faith. And when you give up this lie, it's freeing. It's like breathing fresh, clean air, and you are opened to the possibility of seeing how God really can help us in the reality of life that surrounds us. Jesus once said, the truth will set you free. But most must agree to the journey, to this journey of truth. Let God out of the box. God's not in there anyway. Let life out of the box. Life is not in there anyway. Stop. Breathe. Cling to the truth of Jesus. Agree to the journey.